In the quiet orchards of Ashfield Manor, a sinister secret festers. When apples turn to poison, sickening workers and casting a shadow over Compton Wells, Miss Jane Marple arrives to unravel the truth. Was it a bitter farmer's grudge, a desperate heir's scheme, or a botanist's deadly knowledge? As whispers of curses and betrayal swirl, Miss Marple's keen eye pierces the heart of a village's darkest motives. In this chilling tale of greed and deception, one truth is certain: even the sweetest fruit can hide a deadly core. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Ashfield. The late September light slanted through the mullioned windows of Miss Jane Marple's modest cottage in St. Mary Mead, dappling the chintz armchairs and the polished mahogany table where a single letter lay open. Miss Marple, seated in her favourite chair, her slight figure wrapped in a soft woolen shawl, paused her knitting, a delicate pink scarf, destined for a niece, to reread the elegant, sloping handwriting. The letter was from Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves, a friend from her school days at the long-defunct Miss Pritchard's Academy for Young Ladies. The two women had not met in years, their lives diverging like lanes in a country village, but the tone of Eleanor's missive was warm, tinged with an undercurrent of unease that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. "Dearest Jane," it began, "I find myself in need of your company at Ashfield Manor. The harvest is upon us, and the orchards are bountiful, yet a shadow hangs over us. There have been incidents, and I fear they are not mere accidents. Your clear head and quiet wisdom would be a comfort. Do come, if you can." Miss Marple's bright, bird-like eyes lingered on the word incidents. Eleanor was not given to flights of fancy. Her late husband, Colonel Hargreaves, had been a practical man, and Eleanor had matched him in sensible restraint. A shadow, she thought, was a curious way to describe trouble. Shadows suggested something hidden, something deliberate. She folded the letter carefully, her thin fingers precise, and rose to fetch her timetable from the bureau. The 11:15 train to Compton Wells would do nicely. By midday the following day, Miss Marple alighted at the small, tidy station of Compton Wells, her modest suitcase in hand. The air carried the crisp bite of autumn, mingled with the faint sweetness of apples from the surrounding orchards. A driver, sent by Eleanor, awaited her, a young man with a ruddy face and a deferential nod, who introduced himself as Tom Bradley, one of Ashfield's workers. As they drove through lanes lined with hedgerows, Miss Marple observed the rolling fields, the golden leaves, and the distant outline of Ashfield Manor, its red brick glowing warmly against the grey sky. But her mind was already turning, sifting through the sparse details of Eleanor's letter, like a gardener examining soil. Ashfield Manor was a handsome Georgian house, its symmetry softened by climbing ivy, and the sprawl of orchards that encircled it like a protective moat. Eleanor greeted her at the door, her silver hair neatly pinned, her smile genuine but strained. "Jane, how good of you to come," she said, clasping Miss Marple's hands. Her grip was firm, but her fingers trembled slightly, betraying a nervousness that her composed demeanour sought to conceal. They settled in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with potted ferns and the scent of hothouse flowers. Over tea, served in delicate porcelain cups, Eleanor unburdened herself. "It's the orchard, Jane," she said, her voice low. "The apples are our pride. Sent to markets in London, even to Paris once. But this season, something's gone wrong. 3 of our workers fell ill after eating apples from the eastern section. Nausea, dizziness, a fever that kept them abed for days. The village is whispering of poison, even curses." She twisted her lace handkerchief, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene, but her mind alert. "Poison," she said softly. is a word that carries weight. Have the apples been examined? Eleanor nodded. Dr. Spencer, our local physician, sent samples to a laboratory in London. We're awaiting results, but the workers swear the apples look perfectly ordinary. No blemishes, no odd taste at first. And these workers, who are they? Miss Marple asked, setting her cup down with care. Tom Bradley, whom you met. A strong lad but headstrong. Sarah Finch, a quiet girl who helps with the picking. And old Mr. Grayson, who's been with us since my husband's time. None are the sort to make trouble, but the village is restless. They rely on the orchard's wages. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the orchard stretched beyond, its trees heavy with fruit. And who else has access to this eastern section? Eleanor hesitated. Anyone, I suppose. The workers, my son Philip, his fiancée Clara, the housekeeper Mrs. Dobbs. Even villagers sometimes cut through on their way to the church path. It's never been locked. Miss Marple nodded. Her lips pursed. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where open gardens and unfenced paths invited trust, but also opportunity. Tell me about Philip and Clara, she said gently. Eleanor's face softened, then tightened. Philip is charming, but restless. He's taken to city ways, and I fear he finds Ashfield dull. Clara Morton is his fiancée, a clever girl with a passion for plants. She's been a great help, but Eleanor trailed off, as if unwilling to voice a doubt. Miss Marple did not press. Instead, she smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. I should like to see the orchard, if I may, and perhaps meet this household of yours. As they rose, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the nature of poison, not just the chemical kind, but the slow poison of resentment, greed, or fear. She recalled a case in her own village, where a seemingly harmless jar of preserves had hidden a deadly secret. People, she mused, were not so different from orchards. What appeared wholesome on the surface could conceal rot within. Chapter 2. The Orchard's Secrets. The morning after her arrival at Ashfield Manor, Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of the eastern orchard, her sensible shoes sinking slightly into the dew-damp grass. The air was sharp with the scent of ripe apples, their glossy red skins catching the pale sunlight that filtered through a veil of mist. Rows of trees stretched in orderly lines, their branches bowing under the weight of fruit. Yet there was an undercurrent of unease, as if the orchard itself held its breath. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her keen eyes scanning the scene, noting the orderly paths, the occasional fallen apple, and the distant figure of a worker moving among the trees. Eleanor Hargreaves walked beside her, her steps hesitant, as if reluctant to venture too deeply into the place that had brought such trouble. It's beautiful, isn't it? Eleanor said, her voice tinged with pride and sorrow. My husband planted these trees himself, 30 years ago. Cox's orange pippins mostly, with a few bramleys for cooking. We've never had a bad harvest until now. Miss Marple nodded, her attention drawn to a cluster of trees where the ground seemed disturbed. The earth scuffed as if by hurried feet. And this is the eastern section, where the trouble began? She asked. Yes, Eleanor replied, her hands twisting together. The workers who fell ill, Tom Bradley, Sarah Finch, and Mr. Grayson, were all picking here. They ate apples straight from the trees, as they often do. It's never been a problem before. Miss Marple bent slightly, her movements careful despite her age, and examined a low-hanging apple. It was perfect in appearance, its skin unblemished, its colour a rich, inviting red. Yet she did not touch it. Instead, her gaze fell to the soil beneath, where a faint bluish sheen dusted the earth, almost imperceptible against the brown loam. She straightened, her expression unchanged but her mind alight with possibilities. Have you noticed this residue before? She asked, pointing delicately with her umbrella. Eleanor frowned, peering at the ground. No, I haven't. It could be some new pesticide, perhaps. Thomas Reed, our orchard manager, would know. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured. I should like to meet Mr. Reed, if he's about. Eleanor led the way to a small shed at the orchard's edge, where tools were stacked neatly alongside crates of freshly picked apples. Thomas Reed emerged, a wiry man in his 40s with weathered hands and a face that seemed to guard its thoughts as carefully as a locked diary. His eyes, a sharp grey, flicked over Miss Marple with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Mrs. Hargreaves says you're here to look into our troubles," he said, his tone neutral, but his posture stiff. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, her voice mild. "I understand 3 workers fell ill after eating apples from this section. Can you tell me about the orchard's routines? Pesticides, perhaps, or any recent changes?" Reed wiped his hands on a rag, his movements deliberate. "We use the usual sprays, copper sulfate mostly for blight. Nothing out of the ordinary. The apples were tested last season and passed every standard. I've been over every inch of this place since the illnesses, and I can't find anything amiss." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on his hands, noting a faint blue stain on the cuff of his sleeve, barely visible against the faded fabric. "And who oversees the spraying?" she asked. "I do, mostly," Reed said. "But the workers help, and sometimes Mrs. Hargreaves's son, Philip, lends a hand, though he's not much for manual work. Miss Morton, his fiancée, has been poking about too, asking about soil and pests. Says it's for her studies." Miss Marple nodded, her face a picture of polite interest, though her mind was already weaving connections. "And the workers who fell ill, did they eat from the same tree or different ones?" Reed hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Different trees, I think. They're not precise about it. Tom said he grabbed one off a low branch. Sarah was eating while she picked. And Grayson, well, he's old, likes to sit and eat under the trees. Could have been any of them." "Thank you, Mr. Reed," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "You've been most helpful." As they walked back toward the manor, Eleanor glanced at her friend. "What do you make of him, Jane? Thomas has been with us for years, but he's been distant lately." Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She was thinking of a gardener in St. Mary Mead, who had once sabotaged a neighbour's roses out of petty jealousy, his face as guarded as Reed's. "People," she said at last, "often keep their troubles close, like cards in a game, but they show their hand eventually." The afternoon brought Miss Marple to the manor's drawing room, where Eleanor introduced the household over a light lunch of cold meats and homemade chutney. Philip Hargreaves, Eleanor's son, was a handsome man in his early 30s, with a charming smile that did not quite reach his eyes. His manner was easy, almost too polished, as he regaled Miss Marple with tales of London's theatres and clubs. Yet she noticed how his gaze darted to his mother when the orchard was mentioned, and how his fingers toyed restlessly with his napkin. Clara Morton, Philip's fiancée, was a striking contrast. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, accentuating her sharp, intelligent eyes, and a mouth that suggested both determination and secrecy. She spoke little, but when she did, it was with precision, her words laced with knowledge of botany and chemistry. "I've been studying the orchard soil," she said when Miss Marple inquired about her interests. "The pH levels, the nutrients. It's fascinating how small changes can affect a crop." Mrs. Dobbs, the housekeeper, was a stout woman with a face like a closed book, her grey hair scraped into a tight bun. She served the meal with efficiency, her comments limited to practical matters, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of disapproval in her eyes when Philip laughed too loudly or when Clara mentioned her studies. "Mrs. Dobbs knows every whisper in Compton Wells," Eleanor said fondly. "She's been with us since I was a bride." Miss Marple smiled, her mind noting the dynamics of the room. Philip's charm, Clara's reserve, Mrs. Dobbs's silent judgments, and Eleanor's quiet anxiety. It was like a village dance, she thought, where everyone knew the steps, but not all were willing partners. After lunch, Miss Marple asked to see the orchard again, this time alone. She wandered the eastern section, her umbrella tapping lightly against the ground as she moved from tree to tree. The bluish residue appeared in patches, not uniformly spread, as one might expect from a pesticide. She knelt, careful not to soil her skirt, and examined a cluster of fallen apples. One had a faint bluish tinge, barely noticeable unless one looked closely. She did not touch it, but marked its location in her mind, her thoughts drifting to a case in St. Mary Mead, where a poisoned cake had been left in a vicarage garden, its intent not to kill, but to frighten. Returning to the manor, she found Clara in the conservatory, tending to a tray of seedlings. "You seem very fond of plants, Miss Morton," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "Have you studied poisons as well as nutrients?" Clara's hands paused, a seedling suspended above its pot. "In a way," she said, recovering quickly. "Botany includes toxins, belladonna, foxglove, that sort of thing. But it's purely academic. I'm no poisoner." She laughed, but the sound was brittle. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "Of course not. But knowledge is a powerful thing, isn't it? Like a tool. It depends on how one wields it." That evening, as the household gathered for dinner, Miss Marple observed them closely. Philip was jovial, recounting a story of a London card game gone awry, but his laughter faltered when Eleanor mentioned the laboratory tests. Clara ate sparingly, her gaze flitting to Philip as if gauging his mood. Mrs. Dobbs, serving a joint of lamb, muttered about village gossip and folks meddling where they shouldn't. Reed joined them briefly, his presence stiff, his excuses for leaving early vague. After dinner, Miss Marple sat by the fire in her guest room, her knitting untouched. She thought of the bluish residue, the guarded Mr. Reed, and Clara's knowledge of toxins. Philip's charm, she mused, was like the apples, polished on the surface, but what lay beneath? And Mrs. Dobbs, with her ear to the village's pulse, might know more than she let on. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once unravelled a theft by listening to a maid's idle chatter about a neighbour's habits. Servants, she knew, saw everything. She rose and opened her window, letting the cool night air carry the scent of apples. The orchard lay dark and silent, its secrets buried in the soil. Poison, she thought, was not just a substance, but an intention. Someone had meant to harm, not to kill perhaps, but to disrupt, to frighten. The question was why, and the answer, she suspected, lay not in the apples, but in the hearts of those who tended them. As she closed the window, a faint sound reached her, a rustle, not of leaves, but of footsteps in the orchard below. She peered out, her eyes sharp despite the darkness, but saw only shadows moving among the trees. "Curious," she murmured, and made a mental note to explore further in the morning. For now she returned to her chair, her mind as busy as her knitting needles, weaving a pattern from the threads of suspicion that Ashfield Manor had so generously provided. Chapter 3. A Village of Suspicions. The morning sun cast long shadows over Compton Wells as Miss Jane Marple made her way down the winding lane from Ashfield Manor, her sensible hat shielding her eyes from the autumn glare. The village, a cluster of thatched cottages and stone buildings, lay nestled in a hollow, its church spire piercing the mist like a needle through silk. Miss Marple's destination was the post office, a small establishment where, she knew from experience, gossip flowed as freely as tea in St. Mary Mead. Her umbrella tapped lightly on the cobbled path, a rhythm that matched the steady pace of her thoughts. The bluish residue in the orchard, the guarded manner of Thomas Reed, and the undercurrents of tension in the Hargreaves household had set her mind to work, piecing together fragments like a quilt not yet sewn. The post office was a narrow room, its counter cluttered with parcels and a vase of wilting marigolds. Miss Clara Thompson, the postmistress, looked up from sorting letters, her round face brightening at the sight of a stranger. "Good morning, ma'am," she said, pushing a stray curl behind her ear. "You must be Mrs. Hargreaves's guest. Everyone's talking about the trouble at Ashfield." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth that invited confidence. "So I've heard, Miss Thompson. It's a curious business, these illnesses. What does the village make of it?" Miss Thompson leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, it's a right scandal. Some say it's a curse. Old tales about the Hargreaves stealing that land from the Jenkins family years back. But I reckon it's more earthly than that. Philip Hargreaves, he's in a pickle with money, or so they say. Wants to sell the orchard to some city folk for houses, but his mother won't hear of it. And that Miss Morton, his fiancée, she's always in that greenhouse of hers, mixing up who knows what. Calls it science, but it gives me the shivers." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild interest, though her mind filed away each detail. "Debts can make people desperate," she said softly. "And Miss Morton's studies sound most absorbing. Does she often visit the village?" "Not much," Miss Thompson replied, sorting a stack of envelopes with practiced hands. "Keeps to herself, mostly. But I saw her buying a chemistry book from the travelling bookseller last month. Thick as a brick it was, all about plants and such." Thanking the postmistress, Miss Marple stepped out into the street, her thoughts turning to Philip's financial troubles and Clara's botanical expertise. Debts, she knew, could drive a man to reckless acts, and knowledge of plants could be a dangerous tool in the wrong hands. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young man, pressed by creditors, had tampered with a neighbour's well to force a sale. Human nature, she mused, was as predictable as the seasons, yet always surprising in its particulars. Her next stop was the Red Lion, the village pub, its sign creaking in the breeze. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ale and polished wood. A handful of locals sat at tables, their conversation halting as Miss Marple entered. She ordered a lemonade and took a seat near the window, her unobtrusive presence encouraging the hum of talk to resume. At a corner table, Tom Bradley, the young orchard worker she had met at the station, was speaking heatedly to a burly man with a weathered face. Mr. Jenkins, she gathered, from the postmistress's mention of the old land feud. "You lot at Ashfield are hiding something," Tom said, his voice carrying across the room. "Those apples didn't poison themselves, Jenkins. I was sick as a dog for days." Mr. Jenkins scoffed, his thick fingers tightening around his pint. "Mind your tongue, lad. You ate what you shouldn't, that's all. Always grabbing at the best fruit, you workers." Miss Marple sipped her lemonade, her eyes half closed but missing nothing. Tom's anger seemed born of fear, not guilt, his face flushed with the indignation of youth. Jenkins, however, avoided her gaze, his broad shoulders hunched as if shielding a secret. She noted the mud on his boots, the same rich loam she had seen in the orchard, and the faint tremor in his hand as he lifted his glass. A grudge, she thought, could fester like a wound, and the Jenkins family's history with the Hargreaves was a sore one. Approaching the bar, Miss Marple engaged the publican, a jovial man named Mr. Carter, in conversation about the weather, a topic that inevitably led to the orchard. "It's a bad business," he said, polishing a glass. "The Hargreaves have always been good for Compton Wells, jobs, trade and all. But now folks are scared to buy their apples. Some say it's sabotage, to ruin the manor's name." "Sabotage," Miss Marple repeated, her tone inviting further comment. Mr. Carter leaned closer. "Aye, there's talk of developers sniffing about, wanting to turn the orchard into houses. Philip Hargreaves was in here last month, half drunk, muttering about needing cash. And old Jenkins, his granddad lost that land to the Hargreaves in a bad deal. He's never let it go. Miss Marple thanked him and returned to her seat, her mind sifting through the village's whispers. Philip's debts, Clara's studies, Jenkins's grudge. Each was a thread in a tapestry not yet woven. She thought of the bluish residue in the orchard, its presence too precise to be accidental. Poison, she knew, required not just opportunity, but intent. And intent required a motive. Was it money, revenge, or something deeper? Returning to Ashfield Manor, Miss Marple found Eleanor in the drawing room, her face pale as she read a letter. "Jane, it's from the laboratory," she said, her voice trembling. "They found traces of arsenic in the apple samples. Not enough to kill, but enough to sicken. What does it mean?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained serene. "It means, Eleanor, that someone wished to cause harm. Not fatal, perhaps, but enough to disrupt. Arsenic is not a common pesticide. It was placed deliberately." Eleanor's hands shook as she set the letter down. "But who would do such a thing? The workers? Philip? Surely not Clara." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand. "Let us not jump to conclusions. Tell me, has Philip spoken of selling the orchard?" Eleanor hesitated, her eyes clouding. "He's mentioned it, yes. He says it's a burden, with taxes and upkeep. But this is his father's legacy. I couldn't bear to see it go." Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling the postmistress's words about developers and Philip's debts. "And Mr. Jenkins," she said gently. "Is his family's grievance well known?" "Oh, yes," Eleanor said. "His grandfather claimed the Hargreaves cheated him out of the land in the 1880s. It's nonsense, of course. Legal papers proved it was a fair sale, but the Jenkins family has held a grudge ever since." As they spoke, Philip entered, his charming smile in place but his eyes wary. "Mother, you're not boring Miss Marple with village tales, are you?" he said, his tone light but forced. "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft. "I find village tales most illuminating. They often reveal more than they intend." Philip's smile faltered, and he excused himself, claiming a need to check on the stables. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the tension in his shoulders. He was a young man under pressure, she thought, and pressure could make even the most charming act unwisely. That afternoon, Miss Marple took tea with Clara Morton in the conservatory, where the air was warm and heavy with the scent of earth and greenery. Clara was pruning a small lemon tree, her movements precise. "You must find our little drama tiresome, Miss Marple," she said, her tone polite but guarded. "All this fuss over a few apples." "Not at all," Miss Marple said, her eyes crinkling. "I find it fascinating how a single act can ripple through a community, like a stone in a pond. Have you any thoughts on what might have caused the illnesses?" Clara's scissors paused. "I've wondered if it's environmental, some contaminant in the soil perhaps. I've taken samples, but nothing conclusive yet." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to a shelf where a row of books on botany and chemistry stood, their spines well worn. "You're very thorough," she said. "It reminds me of a young woman in my village who studied herbs. She once found a rare plant that caused quite a stir. Unintentionally, of course." Clara's lips twitched, but she said nothing, returning to her pruning with renewed focus. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the conversation. Clara's knowledge was a double-edged sword, useful yet potentially dangerous. And Philip's debts, Jenkins's grudge, and Reed's stained sleeve were all pieces in a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. As she returned to her room, Miss Marple paused at a window overlooking the orchard. The trees stood silent, their fruit gleaming in the fading light. She thought of the arsenic, its presence a deliberate act, and of the footsteps she had heard the previous night. Someone in Compton Wells, or perhaps closer, was playing a dangerous game, and Miss Marple, with her quiet observation and unerring instinct, was determined to uncover the player before the game turned deadly. Chapter 4. The Botanist's Notebook. Miss Jane Marple sat in the conservatory of Ashfield Manor, the late afternoon light filtering through the glass panes and casting a soft glow over the potted ferns and blooming orchids. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of damp earth and growing things, a contrast to the chill autumn breeze outside. She had chosen this spot deliberately, knowing it was Clara Morton's domain, where the young woman's passion for botany was most evident. Miss Marple's knitting lay idle in her lap, a skein of pale blue wool untouched, as she watched Clara tend to a row of seedlings with the precision of a surgeon. The girl's dark hair was pinned back, her hands steady, but there was a tautness in her posture that suggested she was aware of Miss Marple's scrutiny. "Such a peaceful place," Miss Marple remarked, her voice gentle as she gestured to the greenery. "It must be a comfort to work here, Miss Morton, with all the troubles in the orchard." Clara glanced up, her sharp eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a flicker of caution. "It is," she said, setting down a small trowel. "Plants are predictable, in a way people aren't. They respond to care, to science. No mysteries, just facts." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of kindly interest, though her mind was as alert as ever. "Facts are so reassuring," she said. "In my village, St. Mary Mead, we had a young lady who grew herbs. She knew their properties so well, medicinal and otherwise. I suppose you study such things too?" Clara nodded, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Botany covers it all. Nutrients, growth patterns, even toxins. It's fascinating how a plant can heal or harm, depending on the dose." She gestured to a workbench where a leather-bound notebook lay open, its pages filled with neat sketches of leaves and flowers, alongside chemical formulas written in a precise hand. "That's my record of experiments. Nothing dangerous, of course. Just soil tests and growth studies." "May I?" Miss Marple asked, her tone so mild it seemed almost incidental. Clara hesitated, then pushed the notebook toward her. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly, her eyes scanning the detailed drawings. One page caught her attention, a sketch of belladonna, its dark berries rendered with care, accompanied by notes on its symptoms: nausea, dizziness, fever. The similarity to the orchard workers' illnesses was striking, though she gave no sign of it, merely murmuring, "How thorough you are." Clara's cheeks flushed slightly. "It's just academic," she said quickly. "I've never used those plants. I'm interested in their chemistry, not anything else." "Of course," Miss Marple said, closing the notebook with care. "Knowledge is a tool, isn't it? Like a spade or a knitting needle. It's all in how one uses it." She smiled, her eyes crinkling, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The notebook was a treasure trove, not of guilt, but of possibility. Clara's expertise could be innocent, yet it placed her uncomfortably close to the heart of the mystery. That evening, dinner at Ashfield Manor was a subdued affair. Eleanor Hargreaves presided over the table with quiet dignity, though her eyes betrayed her worry. Philip, usually so charming, was distracted, his fork pushing food around his plate as he spoke of a horse race he'd attended in London. Mrs. Dobbs, the housekeeper, moved silently, her disapproval of Philip's anecdotes palpable in her pursed lips. Thomas Reed, the orchard manager, joined them briefly, his presence as stiff as the starched collar he wore. Miss Marple observed them all, her serene demeanour masking the connections forming in her mind. "Mr. Reed," she said, as he prepared to leave, "have you noticed any strangers in the orchard recently? With the eastern section so open, I imagine it's hard to keep track." Reed paused, his hand on the door. "Strangers? Not really. Villagers pass through sometimes. Mr. Jenkins, for one, likes to cut across on his way to the fields. But I'd notice anyone out of place." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes catching the faint blue stain on his sleeve, unchanged, from the day before. "And the spraying," she continued. "Is it done at specific times? I understand Miss Morton has been studying the soil. Perhaps she's seen something unusual. Clara's fork clattered against her plate, a small sound that drew every eye. "I've only taken samples," she said, her voice steady, but her cheeks pale. "Nothing out of the ordinary." Philip shot her a glance, his smile tight. "Clara's always digging in the dirt," he said, attempting levity. "She'll turn us all into farmers yet." Miss Marple smiled politely, but her thoughts were on the orchard, the bluish residue, and the arsenic confirmed by the laboratory. She recalled a case in St. Mary, Mead, where a young wife had used rat poison to frighten her husband's mistress, not to kill but to warn. The intent behind the poisoned apples, she suspected, was similar. Not murder, but disruption. But why? To scare workers away? To force a sale? Or to settle an old score? After dinner, Miss Marple retired to the drawing room with Eleanor, who seemed eager for her company. "Jane," she said, her voice low, "I can't help feeling this is personal. The orchard is our lifeblood. Who would want to ruin it?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she resumed her knitting, the blue wool forming neat rows. "People act for many reasons, Eleanor," she said. "Money, resentment, fear. Sometimes it's not the act itself, but what it hides. In my village, a stolen necklace turned out to be a distraction from a larger theft. We must look beyond the apples." Eleanor sighed, her hands twisting her handkerchief. "Philip's been so distant. I know he's in debt. Cards mostly and some bad investments. He's talked of selling the orchard, but I thought it was just talk." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was sharp. "And Clara? She seems devoted to Philip." "She is," Eleanor said, hesitating. "But she's intense, always in that greenhouse, writing in her notebook. I sometimes wonder what she's really doing." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts returning to the belladonna sketch. Clara's knowledge was a thread that could lead to innocence or guilt, and she was not yet ready to pull it. Instead, she changed the subject, asking about the village's history with the Hargreaves family. Eleanor recounted the old feud with the Jenkins family, how their grandfather had lost the orchard land in a legal dispute, a wound that had festered through generations. "Mr. Jenkins is a bitter man," she said, "but surely he wouldn't stoop to poison." "People surprise us," Miss Marple said gently. "In St. Mary, Mead, a quiet spinster once poisoned her sister's tea over a shared inheritance. It's not the loud ones we must watch, but the quiet ones with something to hide." As the evening drew on, Miss Marple excused herself, claiming fatigue, but her mind was far from rest. She stood at her bedroom window, gazing out at the darkened orchard. The moonlight silvered the trees, their branches heavy with fruit that now seemed ominous. She thought of the footsteps she had heard the previous night, the rustle that was not leaves but human movement. Someone was watching, or perhaps acting, under cover of darkness. Slipping on her shawl, she decided on a bold course. With her torch in hand, she descended the stairs quietly, avoiding the creaking third step, and stepped into the cool night air. The orchard was silent, save for the occasional hoot of an owl. She moved toward the eastern section, her steps light but purposeful, her eyes scanning the ground. Near the tree where she had seen the bluish residue, she paused, her torch revealing a fresh scuff in the soil, as if something had been buried or unearthed. Kneeling, she brushed aside leaves, her fingers careful not to touch the earth directly. There, glinting faintly, was a small metal cap, the kind that might seal a vial. She wrapped it in her handkerchief, her heart quickening. As she stood, a shadow moved among the trees, swift and silent. Miss Marple froze, her torch extinguished, her breath steady despite the chill that ran through her. The shadow vanished, leaving only the rustle of leaves. She did not pursue. She was no young detective to chase through the dark. Instead, she returned to the manor, the metal cap safe in her pocket, her mind racing with new questions. Back in her room, she examined the cap by lamplight. It was plain, unmarked, but its presence suggested carelessness or haste. She thought of Reed's stained sleeve, Clara's notebook, Philip's debts, and Jenkins's grudge. Each was a piece in a puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. Poison, she knew, was not just a substance but a revelation of character. Someone in Ashfield, or perhaps in Compton Wells, had acted with intent, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to uncover not just the act, but the heart behind it. Chapter 5. A Midnight Discovery. The clock in the hall of Ashfield Manor struck 11, its chimes echoing faintly through the quiet house. Miss Jane Marple sat in her guest room, her knitting abandoned on the bedside table, the pale blue wool untouched. The events of the day, the bluish residue in the orchard, Clara Morton's notebook, Philip Hargreaves's evasive charm, and the village's whispers of curses and grudges, had left her mind too active for sleep. The metal cap she had found in the orchard, now tucked safely in her handkerchief, weighed on her thoughts. It was a small thing, yet in St. Mary Mead, she had learned that the smallest clues often unlocked the largest secrets. She rose, her movements silent, and crossed to the window, parting the heavy curtains to peer into the night. The orchard lay bathed in moonlight, its trees casting long skeletal shadows across the ground. The air was still, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a faint movement near the eastern section, a flicker, not of wind, but of purpose. She recalled the rustle of footsteps from the previous night, and a quiet resolve settled over her. Slipping on her shawl and picking up her torch, she moved with the stealth of one accustomed to observing without being observed. The manor was silent as she descended the stairs, avoiding the creaking third step with practiced care. The back door opened onto the garden, and she stepped into the cool night, her breath visible in the crisp air. The orchard loomed ahead, its rows of trees like sentinels guarding their secrets. She moved toward the eastern section, her torch casting a narrow beam that danced over the grass. The tree where she had found the bluish residue and the metal cap was her destination, its branches heavy with apples that gleamed like forbidden fruit in the moonlight. Kneeling carefully, her skirt tucked to avoid the damp earth, Miss Marple examined the ground. The scuff marks she had noticed earlier were still there, but now she saw something new. A small patch of soil, freshly turned, as if someone had buried something in haste. With a gloved hand, she brushed away the loose earth, revealing a glass vial, its label faded but legible under her torchlight. Arsenic solution. Her heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. The vial was half empty, its cork stopper loose, suggesting it had been used and discarded carelessly. She wrapped the vial in her handkerchief, careful not to touch it, and stood, her eyes scanning the orchard. The shadows were still, but she sensed she was not alone. A faint snap of a twig came from the direction of the shed, and she extinguished her torch, standing motionless in the dark. The sound did not repeat, and after a moment, she made her way back to the manor, her steps as quiet as a cat's. The vial, she knew, was no mere accident. Someone had placed it there, and someone had meant for it to be used. Back in her room, Miss Marple examined the vial by the light of a single lamp. The label was old, its edges worn, but the word arsenic was unmistakable. She thought of the laboratory's report, confirming traces of arsenic in the apples, and of Clara's notebook, with its detailed notes on belladonna. Arsenic was different, cruder, more direct, but its presence confirmed her suspicion that the poisonings were no accident. The question was not just who, but why. To frighten the workers, to ruin the orchard's reputation, or to force Eleanor into a decision she resisted. The next morning, Miss Marple joined Eleanor for breakfast in the dining room, where the scent of toast and coffee mingled with the faint perfume of roses from a vase on the table. She placed the vial, still wrapped in her handkerchief, on the table, watching Eleanor's face closely. "I found this in the orchard last night," she said, her voice calm but deliberate. "It seems to confirm the laboratory's findings." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "Arsenic? In our orchard? Jane, this is dreadful. We must call the police at once." "Not yet," Miss Marple said gently, her eyes crinkling with reassurance. "Let us see how the household reacts to its discovery. Sometimes the guilty betray themselves when the net begins to close." Eleanor nodded, though her hands trembled as she poured tea. "How shall we do it?" she asked. "Leave it to Mrs. Dobbs," Miss Marple suggested. "She's observant, and her tongue is loose enough to spread the news without suspicion. Let her find the vial during her morning rounds. We'll watch who flinches." By mid-morning, Miss Marple had arranged for the vial to be placed in a linen cupboard near the kitchen, where Mrs. Dobbs was sure to discover it. True to form, the housekeeper's voice soon echoed through the hall, shrill with indignation. "Mrs. Hargreaves, you'll never believe what I've found. A bottle of poison, right here in the house." The household gathered quickly, drawn by the commotion. Philip arrived first, his face pale, his usual charm replaced by a nervous frown. "What's this about poison?" he demanded, his eyes darting to the vial in Mrs. Dobbs's hand. Clara followed, her expression curious but guarded, her fingers twisting a strand of hair. "Where was it found?" she asked, her voice steady but her eyes fixed on the vial. Thomas Reed appeared last, his boots muddy from the orchard, his face unreadable. "Likely some old stock from the shed," he said gruffly. "We used to keep rat poison years ago." Miss Marple observed them all, her serene demeanour masking the sharpness of her scrutiny. Philip's agitation was palpable, his hands fidgeting as he avoided his mother's gaze. Clara's curiosity seemed genuine, but there was a tension in her posture that suggested she knew more than she let on. Reed's explanation was plausible, yet his absence earlier that morning, he had claimed urgent business in the village, raised questions. She noted, too, that the blue stain on his sleeve was gone, his shirt freshly changed. Mrs. Dobbs, relishing her role as bearer of news, recounted the discovery to anyone who would listen, her voice carrying to the servants' quarters and beyond. By lunchtime, the manor was abuzz with speculation, and Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, her knitting resumed, but her ears attuned to every whisper. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen brooch had been found in a maid's room, prompting the true thief to betray himself with a careless word. People she knew revealed themselves when pressure was applied. Philip approached her later, his smile forced. "Miss Marple, you don't think this vial means anything serious, do you? It's probably just some old gardening stuff." "Perhaps," she replied, her needles clicking softly. "But arsenic is a curious choice for a garden shed. It suggests intent." "Don't you think?" Philip's smile faltered, and he excused himself, muttering about a letter to write. Clara, meanwhile, lingered in the conservatory, her notebook open but untouched, her eyes distant. Miss Marple watched her through the glass, noting the way her fingers traced the edge of the page, as if wrestling with a thought she dared not voice. Reed's absence earlier that day intrigued her most. She sought out Mrs. Dobbs, who was polishing silver in the pantry, and inquired casually about the orchard manager's habits. "Oh, Mr. Reed's always off somewhere," the housekeeper said, her lips pursed. "Says it's orchard business, but I saw him talking to that Jenkins fellow by the church yesterday. Thick as thieves they were till they saw me." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind turning to the village grudge. Jenkins, with his family's history of resentment, was a likely suspect, yet his knowledge of poisons seemed limited. Reed, however, had access, opportunity, and a guarded manner that suggested hidden depths, and Clara's notebook, with its detailed notes on toxins, could not be ignored. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple stood once more at her window, the orchard dark and silent below. The vial was a significant find, but it was the reactions it provoked that interested her most. Someone in the household, or perhaps just beyond its walls, was playing a dangerous game, and the discovery of the vial had shifted the board. She thought of the footsteps in the orchard, the shadow that had fled, and the metal cap that had led her to the vial. Each was a clue, a thread in a tapestry of deceit, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to weave them into a pattern that would reveal the truth. Chapter 6. The Farmer's Grudge. The morning mist clung to the orchards of Ashfield Manor, softening the outlines of the apple trees as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to Compton Wells. The discovery of the arsenic vial had stirred the household into a quiet frenzy, and she was determined to follow the threads of suspicion that now tangled around the manor's inhabitants and the village beyond. Her sensible shoes crunched on the gravel path, her umbrella tucked under her arm, though the sky was clear. The vial, now locked in a drawer in Eleanor Hargreaves's study, was a tangible clue, but it was the human reactions, Philip's agitation, Clara's guarded curiosity, Reed's absence, that held the key to the mystery. Miss Marple knew from her St. Mary Mead days that people, like gardens, revealed their secrets when disturbed. Her destination was the Red Lion, where the village's pulse beat strongest. The pub was quiet at this hour, its dark beams and polished tables empty, save for a lone figure at the bar, Mr. Jenkins, the farmer whose family grudge against the Hargreaves was the stuff of local legend. His broad frame was hunched over a glass of whiskey, his weathered face set in a scowl. Miss Marple ordered a ginger beer and settled at a nearby table, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. She opened her knitting bag, her needles clicking softly, a rhythm that invited conversation without demanding it. Mr. Carter, the publican, emerged from the back, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Morning, miss," he said, nodding to Miss Marple. "Heard about that vial up at Ashfield. Proper nasty business." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice mild. "It's curious how such a small thing can cause so much stir. I suppose the village has its own thoughts on the matter." Carter glanced at Jenkins, then leaned closer. "Plenty of talk. Some say it's old Jenkins here, stirring up trouble. His granddad never got over losing that orchard land. Others reckon it's someone closer to the manor. Young Philip, maybe, with his debts piling up." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Jenkins, who had stiffened at the mention of his name, but did not turn. "A grudge can linger," she said softly, "like a weed in a garden. It takes root if not pulled out." Carter nodded, moving off to polish glasses, and Miss Marple sipped her ginger beer, her gaze resting on Jenkins. She recalled Mrs. Dobbs's comment about seeing him with Thomas Reed near the church, their heads bent together like conspirators. Approaching the bar, she addressed him directly, her tone as gentle as if she were discussing the weather. "Mr. Jenkins, I understand your family has a long history with the Ashfield orchard. It must be hard seeing it thrive while old wounds remain." Jenkins turned, his eyes narrowed, but her kindly expression seemed to disarm him. "Old wounds, aye," he muttered, his voice rough with whiskey and resentment. "My granddad was cheated out of that land. Fair sale, they called it, but it was trickery. Hargreaves had the lawyers, we had nothing. Now they're poisoning their own apples, and folks look at me like I'm to blame." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with interest. "The vial, you mean? A dreadful thing. Have you heard any talk of who might have placed it there?" Jenkins drained his glass, his hand steady but his knuckles white. "Talk's cheap. I've been near the orchard, sure. Path runs through it to my fields, but I don't touch their cursed fruit. If you ask me, it's an inside job. That Philip's always scheming, and his lady friend's got her nose in things she shouldn't." Miss Marple nodded, her face a picture of sympathy. though her mind was cataloguing his words. Jenkins' bitterness was palpable, but his knowledge of poisons seemed limited to village gossip. Yet his presence in the orchard, admitted so casually, was a thread worth following. She thanked him and returned to her table. Her knitting resumed, but her thoughts elsewhere. In St. Mary Mead, a farmer had once sabotaged a neighbour's crops over a disputed fence line, his anger masking a deeper hurt. Jenkins, she suspected, carried a similar wound, but whether it had driven him to poison remained unclear. Returning to Ashfield, Miss Marple found Eleanor in the drawing room, her face drawn as she sorted through household accounts. "Jane, this business with the vial has me at my wits' end," she said. "The workers are refusing to pick in the eastern section, and Philip's talking of selling again. I don't know what to do." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch as comforting as her voice. "Courage, Eleanor. We're closer to the truth than you think. Tell me, has Mr. Reed been about today?" Eleanor frowned. "He was in the orchard this morning, but he left suddenly. Said he had to see a supplier in the next village. He's been so odd lately, Jane. Always checking the trees, but not like he used to." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts returning to Reed's stained sleeve, now conveniently gone, and his absence during the vial's discovery. She excused herself and sought out Clara, who was in the greenhouse, her hands buried in a pot of soil. "Miss Morton," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational, "I understand you've been studying the orchard soil. Have you noticed anything unusual? Say, a bluish residue?" Clara's hands paused, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a flicker of unease. "I've seen nothing like that," she said, her voice steady. "My tests are for nutrients, not anything else." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Of course. But with your knowledge, you'd notice anything out of place, wouldn't you? Like a gardener spotting a weed." Clara's lips twitched, but she said nothing, returning to her work with a focus that seemed forced. Miss Marple left her, her mind turning over the girl's guarded manner. Clara's expertise was a double-edged sword, and her reluctance to engage suggested she was protecting something, or someone. That afternoon, Miss Marple ventured back to the village, this time to the church, where Mrs. Dobbs had mentioned seeing Reed and Jenkins together. The churchyard was quiet, its ancient yews casting long shadows over weathered gravestones. She found the vicar, Mr. Langley, tending to a rose bush near the gate. He was a thin, earnest man, eager to chat with a visitor. "Terrible business at Ashfield," he said, shaking his head. "The orchard's always been a blessing to Compton Wells, but now it's a source of fear." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I hear Mr. Jenkins has strong feelings about the orchard. Has he spoken of it to you?" The vicar sighed. "Oh yes. He's in here often, praying by his grandfather's grave. He's bitter, Miss Marple, but I can't imagine him poisoning apples. He's more likely to curse the Hargreaves in words than deeds." "And Mr. Reed?" she asked, her tone light. "I understand he's been seen with Jenkins recently." Mr. Langley hesitated, his pruning shears pausing. "I did see them talking by the lich gate 2 days ago. They stopped when I approached, but it looked serious. Reed's a good man, but he's been under strain. The orchard's troubles weigh on him." Miss Marple thanked him and wandered the churchyard, her eyes falling on the Jenkins family plot, its stones moss-covered but legible. The grudge, she thought, was a living thing, passed down like an heirloom. But was it enough to drive Jenkins to poison? And what of Reed, whose guarded manner and sudden absences suggested a deeper involvement? Back at the manor, she found Philip in the library, a glass of brandy in hand despite the early hour. "Miss Marple," he said, his smile strained, "you're turning our quiet corner into a detective's playground. Found any more vials?" "Not yet," she replied, her eyes meeting his with quiet scrutiny. "But I find it curious how quickly news of the vial spread. Someone, perhaps, was eager for it to be known." Philip's hand tightened on his glass, but he laughed. "Village gossip, that's all. You know how it is. Nothing stays secret for long. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her voice soft. But secrets have a way of surfacing, like roots breaking through the soil. As she left the library, she caught sight of Reed returning from the village, his face flushed, his coat dusted with the same loam she had seen in the orchard. She made a mental note to watch him closely, for his actions, like the vial, suggested carelessness, or perhaps a deliberate attempt to divert suspicion. The day closed with a quiet dinner, the household subdued by the weight of the mystery. Miss Marple sat by the fire afterward, her knitting a pretext for observation. The pieces were falling into place. Jenkins's grudge, Reed's evasions, Clara's knowledge, and Philip's debts. The arsenic was no accident, but its purpose remained elusive. Was it to ruin the orchard's reputation, to force a sale, or to settle an old score? And the footsteps in the night, whose were they? She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a hidden letter had revealed a motive no one suspected. The truth, she knew, was close, waiting to be uncovered by a gentle tug on the right thread. Chapter 7. The Truth Unravelled. The drawing-room of Ashfield Manor glowed softly in the lamplight, its heavy drapes drawn against the autumn evening's chill. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, her serene demeanour belying the sharp focus of her mind. The household had gathered at her request, an air of unease settling over them like dust. Eleanor Hargreaves stood by the fireplace, her face pale but resolute, her hands clasped tightly. Philip Hargreaves lounged in an armchair, his casual posture a thin veneer over his tension. Clara Morton sat erect, her dark eyes watchful, while Thomas Reed stood near the door, his wiry frame stiff, his gaze fixed on the floor. Mrs. Dobbs, the housekeeper, hovered at the edge of the room, her disapproval as palpable as the scent of beeswax polish. Miss Marple had placed the arsenic vial, still wrapped in her handkerchief, on the mahogany table at the room's centre, its presence a silent accusation. She surveyed the faces before her, each revealing a flicker of emotion, fear, curiosity, defiance, that she catalogued with the precision of a botanist studying leaves. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice gentle but carrying the weight of authority. "The matter of the poisoned apples in the eastern orchard cannot be ignored. The vial before us confirms that this was no accident, but a deliberate act. The question is not just who, but why." Eleanor's hand trembled, and she gripped the mantel for support. "Jane, surely you don't think one of us—" Miss Marple raised a hand, her gesture calming. "Let us consider the facts. 3 workers, Tom Bradley, Sarah Finch, and Mr. Grayson, fell ill after eating apples from specific trees. The laboratory found arsenic, a poison not used in orchards, applied selectively to cause sickness, not death. This suggests intent, not to kill, but to frighten, to disrupt, perhaps to force a decision or to settle a score." Her eyes moved to Philip, whose fingers tightened on the arm of his chair. "Mr. Hargreaves," she said, "you've spoken of selling the orchard. Debts, I understand, can weigh heavily on a young man. A scandal like this might persuade your mother to let the land go." Philip's face flushed, his charm replaced by indignation. "That's absurd. I'd never harm the orchard. It's my inheritance. Yes, I've debts, but I wouldn't stoop to poison." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "Of course, but silence can be as telling as action. You knew of the illnesses, yet said nothing, perhaps hoping they would serve your ends." Philip's mouth opened, then closed, his eyes darting to Clara, who remained silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple turned to her. "Miss Morton, your knowledge of botany is impressive. Your notebook details toxins like belladonna, whose symptoms mirror those of the workers. Arsenic is cruder, but your expertise makes you a figure of interest." Clara's eyes flashed, but her voice was steady. "I study plants, Miss Marple, not poisons. I've never touched arsenic, I told you I saw someone in the orchard at night, weeks ago. I didn't speak up because I wasn't sure who it was. Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind was sharp. Yes, you mentioned a figure in the dark. A valuable observation, if true. But knowledge, like a tool, can be wielded by others. She turned to Thomas Reed, whose jaw was clenched, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Mr. Reed, you've managed the orchard for years. You know its rhythms, its vulnerabilities. The bluish residue I found matches a stain I saw on your sleeve. Gone now, I notice. And you were absent when the vial was discovered, claiming business in the village. Reed's face darkened, his voice low but firm. I found that vial weeks ago, near the eastern trees. I hid it in the shed, thinking to protect the manor's name. I never used it, I swear. I've poured my life into this orchard. Why would I ruin it? Miss Marple's eyes crinkled, but her tone was unrelenting. Loyalty can mask other motives, Mr. Reed. You were seen with Mr. Jenkins, whose family harbours a grudge against the Hargreaves. A grudge, I've learned, rooted in a land dispute from decades past. Eleanor gasped softly, but Miss Marple continued, her voice steady as her knitting needles. Mr. Jenkins, though not here, is central to this puzzle. His bitterness is well known, and he admitted to passing through the orchard. The arsenic was applied clumsily, affecting only a few trees, as if by someone unfamiliar with precision, but driven by anger. I believe Jenkins, fueled by his family's resentment, scattered the poison to tarnish the Hargreaves' name. She paused, letting the words settle. But the truth is layered, like soil in a garden. Philip, you knew of the illnesses and saw an opportunity to push for a sale, though you did not act directly. Mr. Reed, you found the vial but chose silence, perhaps to protect the orchard, or perhaps to protect yourself. Miss Morton, your silence about the figure in the orchard suggests caution or complicity. Clara stood, her voice sharp. I'm no accomplice. I saw Jenkins that night, skulking near the trees. I didn't say anything because I feared Philip would be blamed. With all the talk of his debts, Philip's head snapped up. Clara, you should have told me. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was clear. And you, Philip, should have spoken up. Silence, in its way, is a kind of poison. Mrs. Dobbs, who'd been listening silently, muttered, Village talk always said Jenkins was trouble. I saw him and Reed whispering, like they were planning something. Reed shook his head. We were talking about the harvest, nothing more. I didn't know about the poison till I found the vial. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts coalescing. I believe you, Mr. Reed. Your loyalty is to the orchard, not to Jenkins. But Jenkins, with his grudge, acted alone, his anger spilling over into a reckless act. The police will confirm this, I'm sure. She turned to Eleanor. Call them now, my dear. Let them speak to Mr. Jenkins. The truth is out, and the orchard will be safe. As Eleanor moved to the telephone, Philip slumped in his chair, his face a mix of shame and relief. Clara reached for his hand, her expression softening. Reed exhaled, his shoulders relaxing for the first time. Mrs. Dobbs bustled off, muttering about the scandal's end. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a poisoned letter had once unravelled a family's secrets. Here, the poison was in the apples, but the motives, greed, resentment, silence, were as familiar as the lanes of her village. The truth, she knew, was not in the act alone, but in the hearts that allowed it to fester. Chapter 8. The harvest restored. The morning sun rose over Ashfield Manor, casting a golden light across the orchards, where the apple trees stood in quiet resilience, their branches still heavy with fruit despite the shadow that had lingered over them. Miss Jane Marple sat in the conservatory, her knitting needles moving rhythmically as she worked on the pale blue scarf, now nearly complete. The air was warm, scented with the faint tang of citrus from Clara Morton's seedlings, and the manor felt lighter, as if a storm had passed. The events of the previous evening, the gathering in the drawing room, the unravelling of motives, and the call to the police had left the household subdued but relieved, like a village after a long drought. Eleanor Hargreaves joined her, a tray of tea in her hands, her face less drawn than it had been in days. "Jane," she said, setting the tray down, "I can't thank you enough. The police took Mr. Jenkins this morning. He confessed, said he scattered the arsenic to ruin our name, to make us sell. He didn't mean to hurt anyone, or so he claims." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with a gentle smile. "People often act in haste, Eleanor, and regret follows slowly. Mr. Jenkins's grudge was a heavy burden, but it's lifted now." Eleanor poured the tea, her hands steady for the first time in Miss Marple's visit. He admitted to sneaking into the orchard at night weeks ago with a vial he'd kept from his father's old shed. He thought a few sick workers would start rumours, force us to sell, but he didn't count on you, Jane. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene. "I only listened, my dear. The truth is always there, like a seed in the soil. It only needs a little light to grow." The police had arrived promptly after the drawing-room confrontation, their questions thorough, but guided by Miss Marple's clear account. Jenkins, faced with the vial and Clara's testimony of seeing him in the orchard, had crumbled, his bitterness giving way to a weary admission. The arsenic, he said, was meant to scare, not kill, a petty revenge for a decades-old wrong. The workers' illnesses were an unintended consequence, one that had shaken him more than he let on. Philip entered the conservatory, his usual charm tempered by a new sobriety. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I owe you an apology. I should have spoken up about the illnesses, the talk of selling. I let my troubles cloud my judgment." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes meeting his with quiet understanding. "We all falter, Mr. Hargreaves. What matters is what you do now. The orchard is your family's legacy. Perhaps you'll find a way to honour it." Philip nodded, his gaze drifting to the window where the orchard stretched beyond. "I've promised Mother to stay, to help rebuild. No more talk of selling. And Clara, she's already planning ways to test the soil, make sure it's safe." Clara joined them, her dark hair soft for once, not pinned tightly back. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice earnest, "about using my studies to help. There are natural ways to protect the trees, to restore the orchard's reputation. I want to make things right." Miss Marple smiled, noting the sincerity in Clara's eyes. "Knowledge, Miss Morton, is a gift when used well. I've no doubt you'll do just that." Mrs. Dobbs bustled in, a basket of apples in her arms, carefully selected from the western section, untouched by the poison. "These are for you, Miss Marple," she said, her dour face softened by a rare smile. "Clean as a whistle. I made sure. We'll have the eastern section cleared and tested by next week." Miss Marple accepted the basket, her fingers brushing the smooth, unblemished skins. "Thank you, Mrs. Dobbs. There's nothing quite like a good apple, is there? So long as one knows its source." As the day wore on, Miss Marple prepared to leave Ashfield, her small suitcase packed with the efficiency of long habit. Eleanor walked her to the station, the lane lined with hedgerows now tinged with autumn's gold. "You've saved us, Jane," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just the orchard, but the family. I was so afraid we'd lose everything." Miss Marple took her friend's hand, her grip firm despite her delicate frame. "People are like apples, Eleanor. Some are sweet, some bitter, and some hide a poison within. It's only a matter of looking closely, of seeing what's beneath the shine." The train to St. Mary Mead arrived with a puff of steam, and Miss Marple boarded, the basket of apples tucked under her arm. As the countryside rolled past, she thought of Compton Wells, of Jenkins' bitter grudge, Philip's reckless silence, and Clara's guarded knowledge. The orchard would recover, its fruit once more a source of pride rather than fear. She recalled a case in her own village, where a poisoned jar of jam had nearly torn a family apart, only to reveal the strength beneath their flaws. Human nature, she mused, was as constant as the seasons, yet each mystery brought its own surprises. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple set the apples on her kitchen table, their red skins catching the evening light. She resumed her knitting, the blue scarf nearly finished, her needles clicking in time with her thoughts. The case of the poisoned apple orchard faded into the quiet rhythm of St. Mary Mead, but her sharp eyes remained watchful, ever ready for the next shadow to cross her path.